Hello, everyone, and welcome to ChefConf 2021. I'm Sudeep Charles, and I'm a product marketer at Progress and the moderator for today's discussion on continuous compliance and productivity with Chef Desktop. Over the next 45 odd minutes, we'll discuss a bunch of things, right? So, the reality of a distributed workforce, what challenges that poses from a fleet management perspective. We'll also discuss a little bit about data breaches and how human error is actually causing a lot of that. And what can you do from an organization perspective to keep your systems, your laptops and desktops in continuous visibility and compliance? And lastly, of course, employee productivity is taking a little bit of a hit with this whole distributed nature of work. How do you get employees to be productive a little faster by provisioning their systems at the get-go, right? So to discuss all of this, we have a wonderful panel with us today. And on that panel, we have Neve Cahill. She is our sales engineering leader at Chef. She's been a solutions architect in the past with a very strong experience in design and implementing of management solutions on mobile, wireless, and network providers for very large enterprise environments. And she's been doing this forever, right? Rich experience in telecom, financial services, and healthcare verticals. We also have Spencer Hopkins, our sales leader for North America. Got close to 2 decades of experience in enterprise sales. Most importantly, he's got a very nuanced understanding of the markets. Right? So he'll tell us a little bit about what's happening with organizations and how they're tackling a bunch of these challenges. Then finally, last but not the least, we have Nishal Reddy. He's on the panel and he's from the product management function. He heads product management for Chef Desktop, and of course, also takes care of some of our SaaS initiatives, right? So with that, let's get started. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin this session. This panel discussion, along with all the ChefConf sessions, will be on demand as part of the ChefConf this year, and you can find all of that at chef.io/ChefConf. We'll be handling questions and comments via the Chef community Slack channel this year. And that's a little different from the last. With that, let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about the distributed nature of work and the challenges that causes, right? So Spencer, let's start with you, right? So a large number of companies still have a significant portion of their workforce working from home. What challenges do you see this causing from a fleet management perspective, especially when it comes down to desktop, laptops, or kiosks?
Sure. Yeah, not only do a lot of companies still have a significant portion of their workforce working from home, but they're also still hiring like crazy, right? And so it's bringing on a lot of new employees while still maintaining the current employee headcount and thinking about really how do you satisfy their needs to make working from home very easy for them, right? And people are not only saying like, hey, I want a Windows laptop, they're saying, hey, I might want a Linux laptop or a Mac OS laptop or a Windows laptop. And so you start to think about, hey, these people are accessing our systems, our internal systems from Starbucks, from their home Wi-Fi, from any kind of system that's not necessarily hard plugged right into the four walls of our organization. And so you really start to think about how do we avoid making the news, right? How do we make sure that all of these laptops that our X thousand of employees have out there at their homes or at their coffee shops or whatever are still secure and are still managed and configured to the configuration settings that we set out as an organization, and our CISO sets out that we think about compliance and security controls. And so a lot of organizations are saying, hey, we want to allow our employees to work from home and we want to continue our hiring needs, but we also want to make sure that they have a secure access into all of our homegrown systems and that kind of thing. And so people are getting a lot more intelligent around how do they configure all these laptops for their employees? And then even more so, how do we make sure that those configurations are constantly secure and compliant with all of our security needs? And so this idea about DevSecOps and automation for the fleet management of desktop is really starting to take off, right? Instead of just thinking about our data centers or our cloud workloads, thinking about all endpoints that we might be able to control and make sure that they're compliant. And desktop is just the next sort of natural iteration of that beyond servers and thinking about those edge type use cases. And that's where Chef and a lot of our customers are taking us.
Sure. And just to take that a little further, Spencer, do you see a lot of manual tasks being error prone? Do you see that causing a little bit of a hit on productivity? I know you covered a lot of the DevSecOps bit. You covered a lot of that as well. But just in terms of, hey, we can test out a bunch of changes and roll that out. Uh, that not being able to happen, do you see that actually causing a lot of challenges in terms of manual tasks being error prone?
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, the whole thing we've always kind of pushed towards, the automation is this human-free zones and allowing the robots to take out any sort of issues as we try to push out a change into production. That same kind of configuration controls and really smart processes can lend itself really well to desktop configuration. And again, it's trying to say like, hey, we need to automate those changes, make sure those changes are bulletproof and aren't going to cause any problems into production. We need to get out of sort of the manual testing of that and build the test that we want to test those changes against and make it an automated process so that you're getting away from any sort of manual intervention, any sort of human intervention, which could cause mistakes or whatever. Create the tests and then automate against those tests so that those changes, can go into production, error-free. That's where a lot of companies have gone in terms of application development, that kind of thing. It's the next sort of way to think about how do I manage the configuration of our desktops in a very similar way.
Got it. And Need, do you see some of this as well, right? The whole distributed nature of work, managing large fleets of laptops and desktops across multiple operating systems. How do you see that playing out? Do you see that being a challenge? What's your take?
Absolutely. And I think that, before COVID, there were certain approaches that simply don't work anymore, right? There were certain assumptions that at some point you would be in the office with your laptop, at which point configurations and updates were applied. There was also less of a focus around enabling employees to be successful. So I think one of the keys to this approach is what Spencer just highlighted, which is it's not just about making sure that an employee's laptop or endpoint is secure. It's also about enabling them to have the tools, the software, the correct access to do their jobs, and making sure that that's set up from day one. Because if you take, for example, 45 days to onboard and enable an end user, that's really lost productivity right there. And then you have everybody working remotely and you're onboarding lots and lots of new people very rapidly. Now you really have a situation where a lot of productivity can be lost at that point. So yes, and I think the key value prop around, what we're talking about here and is really taking that DevOps approach around, making sure that you can support all of these different use cases in an automated and standardized way, right?
Absolutely. Nishchal, do you see some of that in terms of the way products are now being fashioned, especially in terms of just helping organizations provision their and manage their laptops, desktops, their fleets overall?
Yep, totally. So I think this whole remote work is like the biggest black swan event that we've seen in the last decade, right? None of us saw it coming. And to a larger extent, we came out with flying colors. We did not see major outage in any of the services or stuff, right? But it did reveal a lot of gaps in our existing processes and tools, right? So if you think about it, we went from going to office and suddenly the next day we were working from home, right? Which kind of introduced some real challenges, specifically in terms of fleet management or endpoint management. It made it very challenging for IT admins to ensure the devices are properly configured, they are secure, it had proper antivirus software, and most importantly, like Neve called out, ensuring that employees have everything they need to be productive and successful, right? And also just doubling down on what Neve said, the existing processes and tools are not really built for this new normal, right? And this is where new practices like applying some of the DevSecOps principles on the fleet management is really taking off. Yep.
Got it. And just want to take it a little bit further, right? So a lot of companies, especially the larger, more legacy kind of places, tend to depend, Nishchal, on being connected to a VPN or some sort of a domain attached kind of a situation, right? And that itself causes a number of issues, right? So you basically decide one day to connect to a VPN, and then you've got like a bunch of updates that are happening. How do you see, firms really trying to adjust to the changes that you just spoke about in the context of being really dependent on VPNs?
Yeah, so this is an excellent discussion, and this has been a writing on the wall for a very long time, right? But it became very prominent because of the pace at which we were forced to go remote. We didn't had any option, right? And if you look at past couple of years, the adoption of cloud and SaaS applications has been rising, right? And this kind of reduced the dependency on VPN. Now employees didn't need VPN to actually do their work. They can, access these applications through single sign-on. They don't have to use a VPN software. But on the flip side, IT teams still relied on tools that worked over VPN to manage endpoints, right? Which has introduced problems around the same problems that I talked about, right? To manage these devices, to ensure that these devices are properly configured, they had proper antivirus software, and they are properly patched at regular intervals. It has made it hard because now employees are not connecting to the network via VPN, or they're not coming to the office to plug into the network, right? So it has become really hard for IT teams to do endpoint management. So we need better approach to solve this problem. And there are a couple of ways. First is endpoint management vendors are coming up with solutions to tackle this problem through cloud gateways. But cloud gateways comes with added cost and complexity. And another approach is to switch to entirely a new solution or new tool, but we all can agree that it's very expensive and an involved process, right? But we also came across few companies who were exploring always on VPN. A VPN that will automatically connect as soon as employee opens the laptop. But there are certain limitations with that approach as well, which doesn't provide great user experience and could potentially impact the bandwidth. It all depends on how that is configured, of course. But there is always this question of what if that VPN goes into a bad state, right? You don't have control over managing that machine again. But there is also a hybrid approach to all this, where you can continue to use existing management tools when the devices are connected to the network, either through VPN or when employees comes into the office and plugs into the network. And also have a complementary tool like Chef alongside the existing tool. So it works something like this. You use the existing tool to deploy Chef client onto your fleet, your endpoints, right? And from that point onwards, Chef can take over management aspects of the endpoint. And it can do configuration management. It can ensure that the devices are compliant. It can correct any configuration drifts. So it can also act as a single source of truth or a single pane of glass for your whole suite. And if Chef detects any misconfiguration, for the most extent, it can automatically correct it. In off cases where it can't, maybe this is where IT admin can step in and probably ask employees to connect their machine to VPN so that they can manage it using their existing tools, or maybe do screen sharing session to fix that, right? So these are some of the problems that the organizations are facing because of remote work and the kind of tools that they were using, which were heavily reliant on VPN to be available, or users to be plugged into the network. And these are some of the approaches through which we can solve them.
Sure. And Neve, maybe you could add a little bit, right? So it also impacts end user experience. I think Nischal did talk a little bit about that. When they connect, it's just suddenly you've got like a really large number of updates that are happening. Do you see, a product like Chef Desktop or in any, fleet management kind of a tool help with that over and above, what current tools use without being too reliant on VPNs?
Absolutely. So I think the key with Chef, when you apply the Chef principles to desktop environments, is Chef does not rely on being connected in through the network. It can secure all of its traffic through HTTPS. So all the laptop needs initially is Wi-Fi connection and outbound, inbound internet. So it's very straightforward in terms of requirements. You don't need any additional potentially insecure protocols like WinRM to get down a little bit more into the details of it. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think 4 years ago, I had an experience where I would VPN in every now and then with my Windows laptop, and my laptop would essentially catch fire as it tried to download all of the updates that were being pushed to it at once. And I think if you think about that Chef approach and running Chef Client on a desktop, one of the really key benefits is incremental change. And so rather than doing very large individual updates like the type that I experienced previously, you can be thoughtful in your approach to the updates that you're rolling out to your desktop and laptop fleet. So for example, if you wanted to do an update to a specific version of a particular package, you can manage that very specifically. If you think about, there's a principle in DevOps called blue-green deployments and deployment pipelines. And if you think about that in relation to laptops, you have the ability to do an initial rollout to a subset of your laptops and evaluate whether or not those updates go smoothly. And assuming they do, you can roll out to the balance of your fleet. So there's certain capabilities that are brought to the table with that approach there. The other aspect that's really cool that I think is awesome is across all of the different operating systems, you have the ability to test those changes on your target operating system prior to deployment. So let's make sure that this update, by and large, with a standard laptop is going to succeed. And then you have visibility into whether or not that update did succeed. And I think a lot of the older solutions, there's challenges around visibility, around configuration and compliance. So that's the other aspect to that as well. It's not only did those updates happen, but also were they successful? Let's make sure that they didn't cause half of my laptops to go offline or something like that, right? So there's a lot of flexibility and capabilities in taking this approach. And essentially, it's the Chef infra solution would apply to the desktop use case. And there's a lot of power to that in general. So yeah, I think that's where folks are really seeing value.
Great. But there's the other approach, right? So, and Niamh, maybe you could start with this, right? So MDMs are being used to configure endpoints. Is that an efficient way to doing it? Do you think it's more complementary in the sense of what we do, in terms of using, say, a Chef desktop along with an MDM? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so typically where we see customers be most successful is using Chef in a complementary fashion to MDM. MDM stands for Mobile Device Management, for those of you who are not as familiar with the space. Essentially, what that layer brings to the table is the ability to do lower level management of your desktops. And so if you look at what that means if somebody stole the laptop, you have the ability to brick it remotely. You can control settings like disk encryption and lower level settings through mobile device management solutions. Where those solutions are less powerful is as you go up through the stack. So if you think about lower level system settings, then you have operating system and other application settings and packages you need to add to that. That's where Chef can really bring a lot of power to the table and allow you to manage those deployments in a very desired or target state definition, right? Whereas MDM is really doing more of the the base level work on the actual operating system itself.
Sure. And thanks, Niamh. Nishchal, in terms of scripting as well, do you see this as being an optimal way of doing it? Do MDMs really offer the kind of flexibility that that something like a Chef desktop would? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so Sudeep, if you look at any MDM solution, right, they also have this capability where you can write scripts and deploy it using those solutions. And if you look at any decently sized organization, they have scenarios where they can't do most of the configurations via user interface or out-of-the-box settings that the tool provides. And that is where IT admins typically resort to writing scripts, custom scripts, and deploying them through MDM tool. And this is where there are some gaps in how the kind of functionality that these tools provide. First is using scripting in itself is not optimal. When you write scripts, the code is not modularized, right? You end up copying and pasting a lot of common sections of the code in multiple scripts, and you end up repeating a lot of logic across these scripts, right? Let's say if you see if there are any issues, then you end up changing it in all the places. And as the code base grows, it becomes really hard to organize this code, right? And furthermore, scripts, you also end up writing different scripts for different operating systems, or you'll have one large script with a lot of if and else loops, conditions for different operating systems, right? For Windows do this, for Mac do this, and for Linux do something else, right? A better approach is to actually use a tool or framework that would provide base abstractions, right? And that it's even better if those abstractions are multi-platform, right? You have, let's say, one abstraction that can automatically handle different operating system logic without having to expose all that complexity to the user who's going to consume it, right? So this is where Chef can really fit in to complement and replace some of the scripting capabilities that MDM tools provide. So Chef has this whole abstraction layer on top of OS commands, and a large part we call these abstraction layers as resources. And these resources are actually, a lot of them are multi-platform. So let's say if you want to access a file or if you want to download a file, you have a resource that is cross-platform. You just have to know how to use that resource, and it will figure out how to do it for specific OS, right? So, and Chef is also built on proper programming language. So now you're not confined to rigid framework or a DSL, right? It's a proper programming language with a high degree of flexibility. You can do whatever you want, right? It's highly extensible. And it being code first, you can actually implement some of the best practices, best software development lifecycle processes around it. Like you can set up CI/CD pipelines, you can have peer review process, you can even write tests on top of any configuration changes you would be making, right? That way you can have, you can not only set up proper process, but you can also ensure that all the changes that you would be pushing to your fleet are well tested, and you can fail faster even before pushing all the changes to your larger fleet. That way you can reduce the number of manual errors that would otherwise happen, and also you can move really very fast. And this is one of the reasons that we've seen some of our customers adopt this whole pattern.
Sure. And do you see also a large number of tools being used when you're using an MDM? I mean, that seems like like an implicit fact that you probably didn't state, but that seems like a lot of tools in the tool set and that they would essentially be using to try and get to an end result.
Yeah, definitely. So any typical organization, right, they have host of tools to do different things, right? For example, they have endpoint management tools or MDM tools. They have one for each OS, right? You have one tool for managing your Windows, for Mac, and then if you have sizable number of Linux machines, you'll have a dedicated tool for that as well. Or if you have very few, you don't have any tool in place for your Linux machines. And then you also have vulnerability scanners, you have antivirus software, and for the most extent, right, you have to juggle between these tools to go to the exact same end result. For example, let's say if you want to get some kind of compliance posture of your tool, right, you end up of your fleet, you end up looking into multiple tools to get data from all the sources, and you try to consolidate them into either a single report or an Excel sheet to build that compliance posture, right? But what happens if you find any issue in your fleet? Let's say there is some problem with patching, or let's say your compliance to or your vulnerability scanning tool found an issue in one of the fleet, one of the endpoint, right? Then you have to go and manually fix that. You have to go and manually remediate that. And what we found out is, remediation is mostly manual. So whenever an issue is found, IT teams would typically write a script and deploy it via MDM tool to fix it, or they would just call that user, do screen sharing to go and manually fix it. So although if you look at it, right, there is a lot of sprawl between different tools that are being used, and uh, not just that, finding any configuration drifts or issues in your fleet is one thing, but also fixing that is another huge hurdle that we are seeing, which has been mostly manual. So there is scope for actually automating some of this. So let's say if you can identify certain tools which can consolidate some of these stuff, right? For example, Chef can actually not only do some of the management tasks, but also do compliance scanning as well. So you can actually use Chef to do both compliance scanning, and whenever you find any issues or whenever you find endpoints that are out of compliance, you can write remediation cookbooks to automatically fix the state without you having to go and manually do it. So yeah.
Got it. Got it. And this is something probably, Spencer, you get a lot of, right? So, hey, you've got MDMs on the one side, you've got Chef on the other. How does Chef compare with an MDM, right? Do they? What's your take on that?
Yeah, and Nishal kind of hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, this is kind of the last bastion around automation and that kind of thing, and it's still very heavily sort of manualized, if you will. But like this problem has been solved when you think about application development and delivery, as well as sort of the place that we've always historically played in, which is, infrastructure management, compliance, security. The idea of delivering any of that change as code allows you to use a lot of the processes that Nishal just kind of walked through, which is all around those CI/CD, automation type tools, bringing in source controls like a GitHub or something equivalent, pulling in automated testing, gradual delivery, auditable deployment history, those kind of things where you're leveraging Jenkins, as well as kind of layering Chef on top of that as a way to say, hey, I want to make a change. I want to express that change as code. Therefore, I want to use a lot of sort of the typical processes that are out there. MDM is definitely a needed component of it where, hey, I want to, take my mobile device, I want to wipe it in case it gets stolen from one of my customers, et cetera. But when I think about, I want to make sure that the changes that I push out to that laptop are hardened, they're compliant with all of the internal policies that we have out. We also have an inventory of our entire fleet and all the various changes that we've made against that fleet, a historical understanding of those changes, as well as all the node data that we're collecting. So a lot of those kind of configurations, historical understanding, hardening of the devices, those kind of things are just what happens after MDM places Chef onto the laptop. And so they do work hand in hand, but there's definitely, like, you think about compliance, configuration change, historical view, and security of that laptop. Those are all kind of components that go above and beyond once MDM has sort of pushed that installer onto the laptop. So there's definitely an education and enablement perspective around, teaching customers what, other customers of ours have done with MDM plus sort of Chef. But at the same time, there's also kind of getting them around the concept that, hey, this whole idea around process and how we deliver change has already been pretty well thought out in other areas of the organization. We're just taking that same concept and applying it to, laptops and configurations of those. And people are starting to get their hands around it. It's just, what is that new technology stack specific to desktops compared to how a technology stack might be around application development or, infrastructure servers configuration. Similar kind of idea, but it's just a slightly nuanced technology stack specific to desktop, and MDM is just one of those components.
And that's a really nice way of looking at it as well, Spencer. But just given the whole plethora of these technologies, right? So, Niamh, why don't you take this, right? So, if a company has to really get started with fleet management, right? There are a bunch of things that are on offer. Where do they start? How do you start? And what are good first steps?
Yeah, the way I would approach it and where I've seen customers have success is really around defining, not going big bang initially, but rather defining a basic set of configurations that you would like your fleet to have in general. Maybe it's 5 or 10 configuration settings, and deploying those, rolling those out, and then iterating from there. And just getting really used to the process of deploying change, testing that change prior to updates. I think one of the things that's really great about Chef is that ability, again, to do functional testing prior to those deployments. But I definitely would start small and iterate. And then the other part of that is obviously getting the Chef client onto your laptop. So if you have a mechanism in place to get that done already, that could be a mobile device management solution. It could be a different mechanism. It could also be something like a self-service portal, depending on the type of end users you have. So folks can download a self-enrollment bundle, different solutions like that. So I think the goal there is you don't want to have 500 settings being deployed initially because, with any large change set, you're going to increase the chances that something's going to fail along the way based on different scenarios. But really just start with that base configuration. And then the other thing that's really cool about the Chef solution is, in the same way that you will have different application environments, and we talked about deploying using Chef in that scenario, you can leverage that same approach to deploy configuration stacks to different teams. So your developer teams may be using Linux laptops with specific tooling and specific settings. Somebody who works in finance might have a different set of packages that they need and maybe a more secure and compliant configuration. It just really depends. And what Chef allows you to do, there's a number of different ways to do this, but essentially you can define configuration stacks and deployment stacks and align those to specific teams within your company. But I would definitely start with the base configuration set and then iterate from there as you get more comfortable with the deployment and the solution.
Got it. So basically you're saying start small and scale fast, right? I think, or at least try and scale fast.
Exactly.
Sure. Nishchal, do you agree with that?
Yep. So when you're trying to implement Chef in your organization, I think Neve kind of nailed it. You start small and then you go from there, right? You find the edges that you want to tackle first, and then you go to the core problem. Yep.
And Spencer, do you actually see the market actually trying to do something similar, or are they, going in with both feet and then, kind of finding it difficult to implement, then seeing multiple operating systems, then looking at complexity, and then saying, hey, maybe this was not the right way to go down that road, right? But do you see some of that, or how do you see the market actually adopt a solution like this?
Yeah, I think what happens in reality in a lot of companies is they have some type of solution in place today, and they're starting to realize that either the volume of laptops or the variety of operating systems that are coming at them is just becoming too great for a single solution to kind of manage, right? Maybe it's a Microsoft SCCM type solution or what have you that is really kind of focused on a Windows type machinery. And they just see that a lot of incoming employees are asking for Mac OS or other type of devices. And so to your point, it's really around like, hey, we're struggling with one or two things. And that's just sort of the entry, whether it's, hey, we can't keep our configurations aligned across all of our fleet, or we're just unable to implement various controls or compliance checks that our security team is asking us to do just because the current solution in place isn't working. And so to Neve's point, we kind of start slowly. Let's think about 5 or 6 configurations that we want to apply to a small fleet of laptops. Let's make sure that those are hardened changes as they get pushed out, and we're able to see the history of those changes being applied to the laptops. Hey, we just did that for 100. It's not a huge leap once you have that in place from an automation perspective to go from 100 to 5,000 nodes. You've built out the process, you've hardened that process. Now expanding that across your entire fleet is relatively easy. And so we always coach customers on, hey, let's prove out the value on a small subset. Let's make that a pretty hardened process. And then automating across the fleet is relatively easy. So we can show value on a small proof and then kind of replicate that at scale. So that's kind of where we're trying to say, hey, what's wrong with what you're trying to do today? Let's show how we can solve it. And then once you understand the concept, then expanding that out is relatively easy. So we try to take a current state versus a future desired state and show them a bridge to get there with automation and DevOps, and then kind of scale it out from there.
Got it. Great. Thanks, Spencer. We've talked a little bit, at least a lot, about automating stuff, getting started. But then there is, I think we kind of covered that a little bit in passing. But there's the whole continuous compliance and visibility aspects to actually maintaining and managing fleets, right? And I think very recently, Gartner also observed that I think the compliance spend per 1,000 employees or companies that had at least 1,000 employees grew by more than 42% to a significant number, right? So maybe Spencer, why don't you tell us a little bit, right? Do you actually see spends on compliance in fleet management, just trying to get visibility of laptops and desktops, trying to get that in real time, trying to implement patches and changes and config changes to the fleet? Do you see a lot of spend happening in that direction?
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, this might be changing as time goes on, but when we bring in the security side, they seem to a lot of times either be the group that can either bless something as, hey, this does indeed satisfy all the various security requirements that we're trying to push out, and give something the green light, even though the funding might not come from security, but they give the project a green light. Or they can be the velvet hammer and say, hey, this project does not or almost violates a lot of our security requirements, therefore that project gets halted. And so compliance spend to meet all of the security guidelines is there, but security's role is more of a red light, green light thing. They don't hold the budget to do it. And so the individual teams hold the budget to try and meet the security needs of the organization. And so we quickly try to talk about configurations and how to manage drift and that kind of thing. But you want to be able to bring the security and compliance teams to the table, because they'll help you really shape what the solution should look like, but also give it the blessing that it meets their requirements, which is huge when you're trying to get budget approvals and gain project acceleration. Security and compliance and meeting those needs is becoming a big paramount hurdle that we have to meet in a sales cycle, for sure.
Sure. Let me take that to Niamh, right? I think we kind of assume that visibility of the fleet in real time or close to real time is a given. But do you actually see practitioners and executives responsible for even compliance certification? Do they actually have the visibility to the status of the fleet, to the compliance or the current compliance status in terms of what should be there versus what actually is? Do they actually get to see all of that?
I think they see it partially. However, there's a number of different use cases that we've come across where they simply don't have that right level of visibility. I'll give you an example. So we had one scenario where a lot of folks had deployed either Docker or VirtualBox on their local laptops because they were developers, and they needed that because they wanted a clean room for development and doing different things. Now, that's a perfectly valid use case. However, from a compliance and a security perspective, the challenge for those teams was essentially not necessarily that they wanted to block the developers from doing that, is that they wanted to make sure they were running containers in a secure manner, that they were using the correct container images. On the virtual machine side, they wanted to make sure if they were running, for example, a Windows VM on their Mac laptops, as quite frequently happens, that those VMs they have to account for the licensing, they need to account for antivirus. There's a number of different management layers that go along with that weren't necessarily being addressed by out-of-the-box solutions. And so the first step was essentially to capture who exactly was using those solutions, what versions were they using, and properly enabling and supporting those kinds of use cases. I think the other use case that we often see is you quite frequently will have a question from potentially senior management around, tell me all the laptops that have this particular version of a library, or tell me all the laptops that have this particular setting configured. And you need to very quickly query your fleet and gather that information. So once you're using Chef Client, well, especially as of version 17, we have compliance built right into the Chef Client itself. It becomes straightforward to write a really quick check to see certain settings on your fleet and report that back. So even if you're not actually delivering change to the laptops, just understanding what your steady state is and what exactly is out there is really helpful. And when you version and you're specific about what you're checking for, I think frequently with these solutions, the problem is you have a very large amount of information coming back. And so allowing the query and the check to be specific and aligned to what you actually need is very helpful, right? So you can then report on that and not look at a bunch of potentially false positives. When we look at vulnerability scanning and solutions around that space, just the sheer volume of data and how actionable it is what becomes the challenge, to be quite honest.
I think there's one critical point that you brought up. I just want to make sure that we understand this, right? So you're saying that a product like Desktop, Chef Desktop, would actually help with certification on compliance, which I think a lot of senior executives really, really care very dearly about.
Absolutely. So we out of the box, we have CIS inspect profiles. So what those do is they validate configuration on your target environments to ensure that they're aligned to CIS recommendations. So that content is there as part of the solution. There's also the ability, we have certain remediation content around operating system level settings that you can apply to your fleet as well. So it's not only about, where am I at in relation to compliance or how compliant is my fleet, but also how do I move my fleet to being more compliant in a very pragmatic kind of way? Because I think, if you talk about hardening the operating system on anything, it's very easy to quickly harden yourself into a situation where you might lock yourself out of certain things that are needed. So your Chef really allows you to be granular to that level and turn certain things on and off according to the requirements of those individual teams.
Great. Thank you, Niamh. Nishchal, do you see some of this actually coming out from your customer and prospect conversations, right? Do you see really compliance, visibility to fleet status being an area where executives and key decision makers really find themselves wanting?
Yeah, so compliance has become much more relevant because of the recent changes and the new normal and changes in the kind of work that we are doing lately, right? And if you and couple of years back, the whole focus was around ensuring that the devices are properly configured and properly managed. But with the new latest changes, more and more people working remotely. And like Spencer touched upon, now they can work from their home or coffee shop or potentially ski resort. We don't know where they'll work from, right? So the problem of ensuring that not just these machines are properly configured, but also compliant is much more relevant. So now it is like a recurring theme that the IT leaders are not just looking at ensuring that these are not properly configured and have proper security software installed, but also to ensure that they adhere to certain compliance standards and meet the internal security standards they define in their company. So compliance is definitely coming up a lot.
Sure. And I think all of you in passing brought this up, right? Multiple operating systems really cause a lot of issues, right? In terms of just getting that visibility. And I think, Niamh, you spoke about it in some detail as well. But maybe Spencer, do you actually see that as being a significant challenge where people have got, let's say, a cluster of Mac machines, a cluster of Windows or Linux systems, and really visibility then becomes a problem?
Yes, the short answer is yes, right? Because just as we've talked about like audit controls within your infrastructure, the same way can be applied to laptops, edge devices, whatever. And so a lot of customers, to your previous point around compliance and that kind of thing, 100%, it's how do we protect anything, whether that's laptops, edge devices, et cetera. But then the next point of that is, how do we think about setting our controls, but then being able to apply those controls no matter what the underlying operating system is. And again, as we're giving more and more employees the freedom to say like, hey, you can work remotely, hey, we can support whichever operating system is of your desire, the onus now becomes much more on the organization to make sure that we can get the employees what they want, but we can still meet all of our internal compliance and security and controls around configuration, et cetera. So now you need an enterprise-ready solution behind the scenes that is able to approach Mac OS, Linux, Windows with the same sort of processes and pushing out the same compliance controls and letting the magic of understanding the underlying operating system be handled by the solution, not something that has to be constantly manually interrupted by a human. And so that's the goodness of having an enterprise-ready solution like Chef behind the covers. It allows you to handle multiple cloud environments, multiple OSs, multiple type of use cases for both configuration as well as compliance, and answer a lot of those internal security type needs.
Got it. And Niamh, would you agree? Because one of the inputs that a lot of customers and prospects tell us is that we're able to layer up visibility across different operating systems or machines running different operating systems and still use Chef very seamlessly, right? Is that something that that you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we talked a little bit about aligning configurations and compliance checks to specific team environments or specific sets of requirements within your laptop fleet. Well, that's where Chef can be really flexible, because Chef can go in and evaluate and run certain checks and implement certain configurations based on parameters that it evaluates. So you can have something as basic as, if I'm running on Mac OS, do this. If I'm running on Windows 10, do this. Or if I'm running on Linux, do this other step. And so rather than having to, write multiple different formats of script and PowerShell and, basically Bash or however you might be running scripting on your Linux and Mac OS systems, you now have the ability to be very explicit in terms of, here is the standard that I want to implement, for example, screensaver, right? And you're going to be using different resources across slightly different flavors of resources across different operating systems, but you can have those be very comprehensive in terms of how you're approaching the configuration management around Chef. And I'll go back to that comment about base configuration, right? If you pick 5 settings, rather than having to write 3 different permutations, one for Linux, one for Mac, and one for Windows, you can be very explicit and standardized around how you're approaching that compliance configuration.
Understood. We've talked a little bit about visibility, about compliance, and all the good stuff there, right? But what about remediation? And Nishchal, maybe you can take this one, right? Visibility and all of that is great, but how do you actually remediate? And does Chef Desktop actually make that any easier at all?
Yeah, I think I briefly touched upon this already. So the typical workflow is, they typically have more than one tool, for managing their endpoints and for scanning their machines, vulnerability scanners, and then AV software. And so they try to get the data from multiple sources. They consolidate that, and if they find any issue, the typical process is they try to write some scripts, deploy those scripts via MDM tools, different MDM tools for different OS, obviously. And if they can't do it that way, they try to hop on a call or do screen sharing session to go and fix it, right? So it is predominantly manual. And then there is this another problem that comes with using multiple tools, which is each tool has its own set of processes and ways to do the thing, right? For example, you would change a setting in SCCM in a different way compared to other tool that you use for managing your Mac machines, right? Which brings in a lot of challenge around learning curve. And your process itself is completely different for doing the same thing for different OSs, right? So I think this is where Chef can actually fit and really solve this problem well. Chef can actually do the same thing in a very streamlined process for all the operating systems, not just for management, but also for ensuring compliance and also remediation, right? Like Neve talked about, we have remediation content. So through which, if there are any errors, Chef can actually go back and actually automatically correct it. And you can also write your own remediation content always. So yeah, it's predominantly manual, but there is definitely a scope for picking a tool that can consolidate and streamline your processes and workflows, and then automate some of those manual tasks as well.
Sure. We're almost up on time, but I definitely want to get the the thoughts of the team around a couple of things, right? If there are just 2 things that a company can do to get started with enabling better management of their fleet while also being compliant as well, what should those be, right? And I think we've covered this in bits and pieces, but maybe you can start, and maybe if there are specific aspects of different products or even desktop that you want to call out, this will be a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the way I would approach and start this is essentially, starting with detecting and looking at what are your configurations that you have already deployed. So that first step is baselining your configurations and then identifying, maybe it's as we talked about, the top 5 things that you want to have configured across your fleet, making sure that rollout goes smoothly. Help figuring out how you're going to get Chef Client onto your laptops, whether that's self-service or mobile device management layer, if you already have that in place. And then just also enabling other teams and sharing that that approach with them. So I think part of this, and this is really the cool aspect of DevOps, is it facilitates collaboration. So if you do have development teams out there who are, you start to deploy Chef, sharing that approach with them, making sure that they understand why you're doing this, I think that's really important, socializing the solution internally. And then those teams, I quite frequently find, leverage that approach themselves and then understand, like there's the ability to provide override settings for certain power users if you wanted to do that. I wouldn't start with that, but I say the socialization and sharing of the solution with the broader teams is a really good, often forgotten point as well.
Great. Spencer, key takeaways in terms of where people should start with, what are the things that they really should keep in mind, both for management, fleet management and compliance?
Yeah, I typically we're talking with people that might have the title of client platform engineer or something like that within an organization. And Niamh hit it right on the spot, right? You want to start with a baseline of configuration controls that you want to try and implement across your fleet. But then that idea of bringing different groups to kind of give that input and putting in the right processes so that they can give input. Once you get that baseline understanding of configuration and what those should be and be able to check against those, well, then you want to think about, to your point, maybe we want to layer in certain security or compliance controls, and we're bringing the security team in to kind of understand, hey, how can we on the configuration side work with you on the security side to make sure that our laptops are secured in in the right way and they're compliant to our security needs. So that's where you get to start to work with the different teams that might have an input on this. And that's the best way to get started, right? Think about those baseline controls from both a configuration standpoint as well as a compliance standpoint, show how you can implement those, and then just start iterating on top of those and building that out. That's the best way to get started, and you start to bring more groups to the table and see how they can kind of participate in the process. That's what we've seen become really successful for both growing awareness within customers and then starting to see use cases just get checked off around, hey, different groups bring their use cases to the table. We can just check those off and show how we would satisfy each of those. That's a great way to kind of get started, but also build momentum around the solution.
And those are wonderful suggestions. Thank you, Spencer. Nishal, last thoughts on both compliance and management?
Yeah, I think Niamh and Spencer have already covered it all. You have to start with your strategies around how you're going to get Chef onto the endpoints. Is it through MDMs or is it through self-service or is it some other strategy? And then also to ensure that you have compliance in the mix in the early stages itself, so that you can not only use Chef to manage the endpoints, but also use it to ensure compliance and eventually to remediation as well, right? But apart from these, right, you should also so Chef brings in a new paradigm, right, where you can actually use as code approach to managing your endpoints. So with this new paradigm, you should also think about introducing some processes and good practices that would make the best use of this whole pattern, right? So some things around setting up a source code repository, building a pipeline around it, and having some kind of peer review process, and making sure that any change that is being pushed has some kind of unit tests written around them, right? So by having all these good practices and processes, you'll be able to not only make the best use of Chef, but also follow some really good practices that would ensure that you move fast and you find issues even before they reach to production fleet.
Great. We're up on time. With that, Niamh, Spencer, Nishal, thank you so much for your time, and thanks all for your time today. We hope you've got some very actionable takeaways from this discussion, but do keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sudeep. Bye.